This is Charlas con Café is our speaker series that happens every week. This spring we are partnered with the Confluence Center for Creative Inquiry. So today, as Cristal already said, we are holding a conversation and presentations with 3 experts to examine the current state of Venezuela following the January 3 events. And our speakers will offer a deeper understanding of what is happening from different perspectives. I thank our speakers for taking the time to be here and to share their expertise in a topic that I think things have been happening so fast that it's hard to understand what is going on. So thank you, Gimena Sanchez-Garzoli. She is director of the Andes region at the Washington office of Latin America. She will present on Venezuela within the Trump national security policy and what happened on January 3rd. What are the big questions? How did this affect Colombia as a border region and how it affects the region as a whole? Flo Tomasi will continue. She's a journalist in Telemundo 33 in Sacramento, and she will present on the domestic aftermath of January 3rd. And finally, Dr. Javier Corrales, who is professor of political science at Amherst College, will present on extreme populists, hyper machos, and corporate takeovers. He will discuss the impulses driving the different actors conducting U.S. policy in Venezuela, and he will also discuss what's traditional and non-traditional about the current intervention, with some concluding words about possible paths, if any, for democratization in Venezuela. Okay, so I will give a bio of each presenter right before the presentation, and then we will have, as Cristal already said, a few 20 minutes for Q&A. You feel free to put questions on the chat or comments, or to wait until we go into the Q&A session. Okay, so as I said before, Gimena Sanchez-Garzoli is director of the Andes region at the Washington office on Latin America. She is a human rights and anti-racism advocate at WOLA. WOLA is an independent organization that promotes human rights and justice in the U.S. foreign policy framework in Latin America. For over 19 years, Gimena has brought to DC the voices of people affected by U.S. policies in the region: Afro-descendant, Indigenous people, women, LGBTQ+, trade unionists, victims, and displaced persons. Her work focuses on dismantling illegal armed groups, promoting peace agreements and anti-racism measures, protecting social leaders, seeking justice for atrocities, and defending labor rights. Before working for the Washington office in Latin America, she worked with Peace Brigades International. She provided unarmed physical accompaniment to defenders and communities during the conflict in Colombia. She also worked on displacement in Africa, Asia, and Latin America as an advisor to the UN representative for internationally displaced persons. So, Gimena, thank you very much. She brings a wealth of knowledge and expertise. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marcela. Hello to everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I just want to start by saying that the opinions that will be expressed are my own and the Washington offices on Latin Americas and not the University of Arizona. So it's all on us. I want to start out by saying that the second Trump administration has been heavily guided and influenced by representatives from South Florida, whose viewpoint on the region really revolves around Cuba. Basically, we have a Secretary of State that formerly was a senator from South Florida, and then on the committees that determine policy and funding towards Latin America. In our Republican majority Congress, all of the chair people are from South Florida as well. Many of them are very interested in advancing their own interests concerning Cuba and deeply aligned with the right-wing governments, politicians, and movements in the region. We've seen heavy lobbying here in Washington of the Bolsonaros, Uribismo, Venezuelan opposition. So their view on any country in the region is really determined by whether it is a friend or a foe of Cuba, and their ultimate goal is to topple the Cuban regime. So, according to this view, which has been reflected in Trump's view of the region, Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela, Argentina, and are basically Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela are foes, and then Argentina, Bolsonaro's Brazil, Paraguay, and El Salvador are best friends to the US. And the other countries in between, it really depends on whether or not they follow what the US wants. So in the past year, we've seen US interventions in elections in Argentina, Honduras, and Guatemala, unprecedented interventions, pressure on court cases involving friendly politicians such as Bolsonaro and Uribe to the Trump regime. All of those things are meant to sway electoral outcomes. We've also seen generally that all civility and diplomacy have been lost, and personal attacks against foreign leaders have become very commonplace. The US in the past year pulled out of or undermined most global multilateral institutions and dismantled its own international agency on international development. All cooperation that was economic to Latin America was cut. This includes and results in severe consequences on humanitarian migration and other issues. At the same time, it's dismantled all aspects of the State Department's work on democracy, human rights, gender, women's rights, ethnic rights, LGBTQ persons. All of this is something that we were expecting because this vision is all expressed in Project 2026. So foreign policy in the region has really become transactional with US interests and at times the personal interests of Trump and his associates determining policy. Also, whether or not Trump respects or likes the head of state is often linked to how well those leaders can flatter him. So this is kind of the context we're in. And in late 2025, the administration revealed what its national security strategy is and it's what its national defense strategy is. And basically, the concept that they're following in terms of defense strategy is peace through strength and flexible practical realism, prioritizing homeland defense and enhancing the military industrial base. So now defense has become something that is really seen as a transactional issue, basically trying to figure out on the part of the US which allies need to be on board so that the US can focus on securing resources in the region. This includes basically having what is known as sort of a golden dome, which would advance missile defense and security in the Western Hemisphere, which emphasizes border security and protecting vital interests like the Panama Canal. And then we also see something that's been resuscitated that we haven't had since colonial times, which is that the national security strategy elevates the Western Hemisphere as the #1 geographic priority. That in of itself isn't bad, but what we are deeply disturbed with is that it now is going back to the ideas of the Monroe Doctrine, which was known as the Trump corollary. So basically, we're going back to that view of Latin America as the US's backyard, right? And with this view, the point is to restore US preeminence in the region, defining and controlling mass migration, having a war on the cartels and transnational criminal organizations, containing adversaries such as China and Russia, which are seen as economic competitors, and guaranteeing resources, critical minerals, energy for the US industrial base, and so that the US also can secure new supply chains. All of these two policies has basically led to what we've seen as a global military and geopolitical readjustment, a reduction of troops from out other parts of the region, and an increase in deployment in the Caribbean and Latin America. So we've seen in recent months that that deployment in Caribbean and Latin America has reached up to 34% of the U.S. forces, and this is the highest we've seen since the Cuban Missile Crisis. We've also seen that while these policies say that they have a predisposition toward non-intervention, that really hasn't been the case. What we've seen is a very aggressive stance against specific governments, notably evidenced by the recent operation that occurred in Venezuela on January 3rd. So U.S. military pressure on Venezuela pretty much started right away after Trump too. And basically, we have a lot of issues with that strategy because it was built on a lot of misinformation and legal violations. So the position of WOLA is that the Maduro regime was repressive, and it had intensified its crackdown following the disputed July 24th elections. Also, that it is a regime that was under investigation by the International Criminal Court that reported over 1,000 political prisoners and over 176 forced disappearances. WOLA's view has been that Maduro has utilized this victim narrative to try to gain support, basically used all U.S. militaries to justify further repression, and declared a state of external commotion and stripped opponents of their nationality. That's how WOLA has seen Venezuela. At the same time, we've seen that the U.S. has falsely justified things in order to do the actions that it's taken. One of them is claiming that fentanyl and the cartel of the Suns were, the biggest threat in terms of narco trafficking to the U.S. Fentanyl doesn't come from Venezuela. It mostly comes from other areas. And the cartel of the Suns is a disputed term that they later, after Maduro was in U.S. custody, claimed was not really a real term. And we had seen no evidence of that term or those things. WOLA has also talked about that regardless of this, none of those things justify legally a military action, and there really is no self-defense claim for the U.S. to have taken the actions that it does. So basically, what we've seen is a mounting set of efforts that delegitimize the actual struggle for democracy, and what we've seen is a whole focus on one person. At the same time, we saw an increase of extrajudicial killings, use of lethal force in the Caribbean and the Pacific that's led to more than 130 deaths. This is a legal breach of international law and also a breach of the U.S. Constitution because there was no authorization from the U.S. Congress. Another thing that we saw happening as this was moving forward was that there was also at the same time a criminalization of Venezuelan migrants in the U.S., utilizing some of those terms in terms of misuse of cartels and also the misuse of the term terrorism to basically go and completely ignore the rights of migrants in this country and have zero due process and deportations like the ones that we saw to the Sacat in El Salvador. So we saw that terms like criminal groups like Tren de Aragua all of a sudden are terrorist organizations. We saw that terrorist designations no longer had the type of rigorous determination that they had in the past. In any event, WOLA still claims, and we still believe that despite all of the perhaps terrible things you can think of, there was no justification for what happened on January 3rd. So we were really advocating for restoring democracy through multilateral diplomacy and negotiation. None of that actually happened. And on January 3rd, the U.S. launched a military attack on Caracas, capturing Nicolás Maduro and his wife, Celia Flores. They were transported to New York and are facing narco-terrorism charges. That operation resulted in at least 77 deaths, including 3 civilians and 32 Cuban military personnel. This strike, again, was not authorized by the Congress and violates the UN Charter regarding territorial integrity. We also have observed that Despite this capture, the existing power structure largely remains in Venezuela. The acting president is Delcy Rodriguez. The head of the National Assembly is Jorge Rodriguez. And key figures um, have maintained their ministerial posts, like Diosdado Cabello and Vladimir Paternio Lopez. And basically, we see a situation where this new leadership uses a defiant rhetoric that they're reportedly cooperating with Washington, but they're still acting the same way they did. So Trump declared a big victory. And what's really interesting is that the moment that happened, all of a sudden, the rhetoric on anti-drugs, terrorism, menace to the region all evaporated, and all we hear about is oil and energy and nothing about democracy. Marco Rubio has proposed a three-phase plan of stabilization, recovery, transition. Specifics and details are completely vague. We've seen that the opposition leader, Maria Corina Machado, has met with Trump, but what her role is in any of this is completely undefined. And we've seen that the Maduro regime in general, what remains, has been not changed from one that's committing human rights violations. Um, so this has placed Venezuelans, and this is from the point of view of our president, who is Venezuelan. She's a Venezuelan human rights activist, in a really difficult situation because on the one hand, you know, everything that the U.S. is doing is condemnable. Um, and on the other hand, we don't see that there's been a genuine democratic transition to replace what was a situation that was untenable. So, um, what January 3rd has really made clear to all Latin American leaders, though, is that Trump has no problem applying maximum pressure to get what he wants, and he will make his threats a reality and use the US's full military strength to obtain it, despite the campaign promises of not getting the US involved militarily anywhere and everything else. He will do it. So immediately that same day, January 3rd, he threatened Petro for criticizing. Petro is the president of Colombia, for criticizing him on his action in Venezuela and so forth, and said basically that he should, watch his ass. That's what he said. So we had an immediate situation of fear and destabilization occur, especially along the border. Both Colombia and Venezuela have a very long, porous border, over 2,400 kilometers. And it is a border that has in it about 60% of the ELN guerrilla group. The guerrilla group ELN is also very much in 8 states of Venezuela as well as within Colombia. And it also has the presence of 3 different dissident FARC groups and a whole myriad of other criminal organizations, including regrouped paramilitaries from Colombia, but as well as Venezuelan criminal organizations. So the immediate impact on the border was for a lot of these groups to shift towards Brazil in fear that the US was going to start going after them. And a lot of these members of these illegal groups returned to Colombia and started basically becoming very repressive on the side of Colombia. They kidnapped like 5 police. They started putting in blockades and all of that. So President Petro and Trump had a conversation on the phone. Nobody knows how that happened except for a miracle happened in terms of diplomacy. And they actually met on February 3rd here in Washington. And the meeting was closed door, which I think was very good idea. And what was discussed was not well documented, and I'm not sure there's real clarity of everything they discussed, but in theory, they discussed Venezuela. And the discussion over Venezuela centered around 2 things. One is Colombia being part of that effort with the US to recuperate Venezuela's oil economy, and even to help with Venezuelan exports. And then secondly, to revive an idea that Petro had, that he had presented to Maduro, of jointly combating the illegal armed groups along the border. that situation is very problematic because part of the reason why the ELN and these other groups are able to exist so well in Venezuela is because of long-term corruption and collusion with the military forces in Venezuela. So we're talking about a deep change having to happen for that to really work. As well as the fact that the ELN has been around for more than 60 years and has basically a very different philosophy than other illegal armed groups, where it will lay low and wait when it believes that it is majorly under threat. So that is a whole thing that we don't know is what's going to happen or how it's going to pan out, and nothing official was released. So the other question we have is if they do operations along the border, first, not only are they going to be efficient or succeed or be done the right way, but or will they also just be for show? I say this because a lot of the attacks against the boats and the illegal strikes have really been for show, but really have done absolutely nothing to stop the narcotics trade. And we're not even sure the people they were hitting are, people who are involved in narcotics. The only evidence we have of that is what the Department of War, which is what it's called now, which is Department of Defense, tells us. There's been no real due process in any way, shape, or form. So that's another question. So will this even benefit the people living along the border on the Venezuelan side who are unfortunately having to contend with these illegal groups? Um, it is obvious that we won't see a mass return of Venezuelans anytime soon. And so this also raises the question of, is the US going to continue these deportations of Venezuelans? And if so, are they going to start deporting them more directly to Venezuela rather than other countries? And all of the ethical and moral issues about actually forcing people back into a situation that may not be their best situation. Along with 15 other civil society organizations, WOLA put together a set of ideas of what are like our priority demands of what needs to actually happen now in Venezuela. And I won't bore you with all of them because they're on our website, but basically the proposal looks at what is needed in terms of human rights, what is needed in legal reform, and what is the institutional restoration to really have a situation that would be more in line with respecting human rights and freedoms and protecting people, and that would fit more of a situation that could help people. For example, humanitarian aid is still restricted in Venezuela. So one of the demands is to lift that and make it unrestricted and UN-led humanitarian efforts, not something that has to happen through the Venezuelan institutions, which not only take part of the aid that gets to Venezuela, but they also tend to determine who it goes to, depending on, who they feel like they need to please. Um, and then another part is to guarantee that there is basically some kind of a roadmap on how independence of the judiciary is going to be restored, the electoral branches, and any sort of transition that may or may not happen, right? But moving forward, we have many, many questions on Venezuela. The big one being what is going to happen, whether this U.S. control will even allow a transition, and whether the country's sovereignty over its territory, political, economic, and control over its own natural resources will be reestablished. And will it be Venezuelans who decide this? Or if not, who will be deciding this? Domestically, interestingly, despite the fact that the Trump administration cut all aid, the US Congress, in a bipartisan fashion, at the beginning of February, passed a foreign aid bill that restores global funding. And within that global funding, you have 50 million allocated for democracy programs in Venezuela. There are many questions on this. First, is the Trump administration going to follow the law, which is do what the Congress has basically voted into law? And secondly, if they are going to, who's going to do it? Because they've completely dismantled a cooperation agency that they used, and even their departments within the State Department that work on these things. So we have a lot of questions about how that's going to work out. Um, And for the region, I think the biggest question we have is uh, whether or not Latin American and Caribbean states will align themselves to prevent further interventions of the US, or will some of these states decide to realign themselves towards the US in order to prevent interventions into their country or gain favor? Or will we see a fragmented approach for how the region is going to deal with this new reality? Thank you, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Marcela, you're muted.
Yeah. Thank you, Gimena. We'll leave questions for the end. I did put on the chat a link to WOLA and their, I haven't sent it. Now I did. And their work on Venezuela. So thank you very much. We will continue quickly with Flo Tomasi, and then with Javier, and then we'll have time for questions. So let me introduce Flo Tomasi first. She is a French Venezuelan journalist working across the Americas and the Caribbean. She began her career as a print journalist in France, covering border regions and migration dynamics in Europe. She later worked in Portugal as a public relations manager in the classical music sector before moving to Venezuela, where she reported for the main European television networks. She then relocated to the United States. She earned a second dual master's degree in bilingual journalism and French and Francophone studies from the University of Arizona. And she is currently works as a multimedia journalist for Telemundo in Sacramento, California, covering community issues, public safety, and the Latino experience. So Flo is now preparing to return to Venezuela to continue her international reporting and the broader implications for the region. So thank you, Flo, and you can go ahead.
Thank you very much. I just I think that there was a very important question that was brought in, that very complete first intervention, and I just want to start with this anchor point because I think it's very important, and it really reflects the kind of broader international climate in which we are now, and in which the Venezuelan diaspora is actually placed right now. My colleague asked, is the administration going to keep deporting Venezuelans to a still very unstable country? I just want to remind you all that yesterday, one of my colleagues in Florida, Venezuelan former political refugee, was deported to Venezuela. So this is something that is ongoing, and it's all the paradox of this situation. The country is not safe yet the intervention has shifted the dynamics, and that's one of the things that I will talk about in my intervention. January 3 really revealed a lot to the world about the internal architecture of the Venezuelan state, and I think that is something that we as reporters, we as international correspondents have been missing out. We have missed that information. It wasn't really something that was ongoing in Western media. Western media tend to be really interested in the region when there's, as we say in Venezuela, cuando hay peo. We say very colloquially, very vulgarly, when there are death, when there is a political shift. But otherwise, as you may know, the Western media are not really interested in the Caribbean and American region. For years, Venezuela has been paralyzed in this international media landscape through cycles. We had the protest cycles, now the sanction cycles, the electoral cycles, the negotiation cycles. And Western media will come to Caracas, will come to Venezuela only for those precise cycles that kept repeating themselves. There was some kind of collective feeling in Venezuela where civilians kind of ended as a very resignated, and there was this feeling of This is just something that is ongoing and will start again. We're going to have electoral process, and there's going to be fraud again. And January 3 showed that this is not just another political episode. The system has changed in a way that allows it to absorb the shocks. I'm going to talk about that. For Venezuelans who are living through this system, very complex system, we'll deal with that later. That realization is very important, because whether it brings frustration or fear or resignation, it's a pivot point. The Venezuelan state today is not simply an authoritarian government under oppression. And this is something I had the opportunity to discuss with a lot of colleagues, and especially two Syrian journalist friends who are exiled in France. And right after the world discovered the awful faces of the political prisoners in Syrian regime prisons, we had this conversation, and we agreed on saying this is very different. And I remember when January 3 happened, a lot of people would compare the situation to Syria, but the Venezuelan system is really different. It's a hybrid security regime that has evolved over 2 decades of a so-called revolution, and it rests on three, let's say, interlocking components. The first one is a politicized military hierarchy with a real parallel economy based on arbitrary detention, criminal activities, the cost of arbitrary detention. Let me give you an example. You can be walking in the streets of Caracas or driving your car, and all of a sudden a military stops you and he goes through your phone, or he places a little bit of marijuana in your stuff, and they take you. They say, hey, we're just taking you to the detention center, the helicoided, we're taking you to prison. And you have we don't have numbers because this is very flexible, but you have a certain frame, let's say, of hours where you are able to pay them the amount, thousands of dollars, that they are going to require for you to be released. So this is the first, let's say, component of the system, the military hierarchy. Then there is this expensive intelligence and counterintelligence apparatus, the HISIM, the SEBIN, the military intelligence within the country that was very much developed over 2 decades. We have a very, very sophisticated system of surveillance in Venezuela that was developed on a Soviet system with this idea of collective denunciation and observation. You spy on your neighbor. You can't really know who you can trust because, collectivities are closed, and you never know who is watching you, who has a contact with the regime, who is there to observe you. And the third component of this hybrid security management system, the regime system, is a diffuse network of, let's say, informal territorial enforcement actors that are truly embedded at a community level, and we call them, maybe you have heard of them, the colectivos. The colectivos are those paramilitary, I don't want to use this word, and my colleague who specializes in the ELN and might think this is, but it's some sort of paramilitary militias that work with the regime, but on a barrio level, on a neighborhood level. So those are people you actually know. This transformation did not happen overnight, and my colleague previously said it perfectly. There was, with Hugo Chavez, this progressive politicization of the armed force and the erosion of a professional military doctrine. I just want to remind you that Venezuela army was one of the most prepared of Latin America until the 2000s, when Chavez arrived and started, for instance, replacing all the Western military equipment that Venezuela had with Iranian and Russian technology, which was, in the end, a big mistake strategically, because now Venezuela has an impressive military arsenal with Iranian drones and a very, very recent Russian weapons. But some of those technology platforms, they don't combine together. So if you can't, militarily talking, you can't have this kind of hybrid system. It's just not going to work together. So that's one of the reasons why the army reacted so little on January 3. And over time, loyalty became more valuable than institutional autonomy. Promotions multiplied under Chavez. You had this civil military boundaries that blurred, parallel structures that emerged. You're going to know, to give you an idea of what I'm talking about, but the late 2010s, Venezuela had 2,200 generals, admirals. 2,200, 2,200 generals. You have, to give you an idea, 900 in the US. And so you see the size of the Venezuelan territory and its armed force. And you see, if you compare it with the US, I know this is something that we tend to avoid here because this is a very binary model that we, as my WOLA colleague said, we're trying to avoid a little bit, but this number is ridiculous. It's because of a pattern of distributing rank to secure the loyalty to the regime. And this matters a lot for understanding January 3, because what Venezuela now exhibits is not a cohesive classical military structure that could be vulnerable to rupture if there is a foreign intervention. It's a layered network of loyalties, formal, informal loyalties, designed precisely to be able to absorb shock. And from a journalistic perspective, what January 3 revealed was not just the instability, because that was already there. Venezuelans have been living with that. It revealed institutional adaptation. What is so hard to change? Why are we're not witnessing the changes the Venezuelan people have been expecting for over 2 decades? Why is it so hard to change the core matter of this regime? Because there was no visible split in the high command. I remember after January 3, maybe you've heard that there was a lot of speculations over, is the army going to intervene? Is the army going to shift? And that suggests that over the past decade, the regime has shifted from ideological consolidation with speech, anti-imperialist speech, a communist speech, to security consolidation. In other words, survival has become structural. And propaganda with the ideas and the whole rhetorics around anti-imperialism, that is to hide this. And so January 3 showed that this structural resilience, it's not political legitimacy. And that addresses something less visible but central, that is the social architecture of control. Because one of the most striking elements following January 3 was not what happened, but what did not happen for civils. There was no large-scale mobilization from there either. We saw mobilization here, the diaspora mobilized, but in Venezuela, everybody was really silent. There was no immediate mass protest wave. There was no visible urban uprising. And so this shows you that Venezuelans have been used to this. Venezuela has experienced repeated protest cycles, 2014, 2017, 2019, some of which resulted in hundreds of deaths and thousands of detention. And among them, a lot of young folks, even minors, a lot of students, a lot of high school students. According to Foro Penal, our reference in terms of data for political prisoners in Venezuela, more than 15,000 politically motivated arrests have been documented since 2014. And that doesn't include people who are afraid to talk. So this, as you may imagine, reshapes civils' behavior over time. You learn fear. You have different phones. I know a bunch of people who have 2 or 3 phones. You learn how to clean your phone every time you go outside. You clean your conversation. You learn to talk through codes with your family. And this is where I wanted to get, is that uncertainty becomes a political tool. Uncertainty about whether a protest will lead to detention, about whether surveillance is active. You never know, because the power is so fragmented that you can't focus on just one source of danger. To give you an example, every time I land in Maiquetía, in Caracas, as a journalist, I never wear gear. I never arrive with any camera. I never say I'm a journalist. I'm always very afraid of my arrival. I think that's the moment where I'm most afraid to get to Venezuela. Is this person going to check my name on the internet? Is this person very close to the regime? Is this person who's going to check my paperwork? Does this person need money? Is this person going to ask a few more things than the previous time? Who am I going to have in front of me? And this uncertainty about whether things might happen or not is what lead citizens to calculate risk. And January 3 occurred within that environment. So internally, intervention can be perceived as a risk amplification. We must also consider the role of colectivos. You remember the three components I talked to you about this control structure? The colectivos emerged during the Chavez era. They are framed as those community defense groups, but they are very aligned with the Bolivarian project, and they were given guns and weapons by the regime. They function through proximity. They are known in your barrio. They are your neighbors. Maybe somebody who used to be your friend. They are visible in the barrio. They are in charge of everything in your neighborhood. They are socially embedded. So on one hand, the state relies on these actors for territorial penetration, especially in areas where institutions are weak or distrusted. And on the other hand, reliance on those semi-autonomous networks that introduces a lot of risk, because these actors have their own interest, and they are not always perfectly synchronized with the centralized command. For instance, to give you an example, practical example, last year I interviewed Valentin Santana, one of the main leaders of one of the most violent colectivos of Caracas. They received me after a very long protocol of control of who I was. He is the hardcore seed of Chavismo. He is a leader who keeps talking with a very left embedded rhetorics. If you go to his headquarters, you have pictures of Stalin and Lenin and Hugo Chavez and Fidel Castro and the Che Guevara, along with representation of Palestinian resistant figures, and also mixed with the Hezbollah representations. There's in his headquarters a big virgin with an AK-47. That's a very famous place in that barrio. It's a Virgin Maria with an AK-47, a kufiyya. So it's this kind of mix of symbols that show you this kind of old loyalty to a certain ideology. But there's disalignment within the groups themselves. And this layered model show that control is distributed. And this is why there is so much diffuse anxiety, because when power is sustained through multiple semi-overlapping structures, your stability depends on constant calibration. Should I go there? Should I take this? But maybe this guy is not who I think he is, or you never really know. And January 3 did not break that calibration. It actually showed the world the extent to which Venezuelan governance now relies less on this ideological mobilization I was talking about and more on securized a system. And that shift is fundamental to understanding why intervention does not automatically translate into rupture. To finish really quickly within 5 minutes, the January 3, let's keep in mind that it was not experienced solely inside Venezuela. It's something that reverberated, that's a complicated term, but it exploded immediately across the diaspora. 7 million people abroad, 7 million Venezuelan. And in the days following January 3, when there was this kind of very big noise and so many speculation and so many radical positions from foreign potencies being established, in the days following January 3, after the first glimpse of celebration that such a cathartic image like the one of a dictator being held by authorities can bring, this cathartic joy that many Venezuelans expressed after that in interviews, in conversations, in the diaspora's communities, what you had was not relief, it was uncertainty. The same uncertainty that they cultivate in Venezuela. Of course, this celebration, Maduro on American soil, escorted by the DEA to prison, is a symbol itself for the oppressed Venezuelan people. You know, like, oh, the big guys have came and now they have him. But then for Venezuelans abroad, those seeking asylum, TPS, Venezuelan, other form of legal protection, those moments generate big legal and psychological consequences. They raise questions about return, safety, whether instability is going to deepen or harden, and this is why internally and transnationally we can't just frame the intervention as all black and white. Many Venezuelans abroad carry memories of protests, that 2014, 2017, 2019, very violent protests. And so when an external intervention occurs, it does not enter a neutral psychological landscape. You got to keep that in mind. So this is something journalism captures in a way maybe policy analysis sometimes does not. Policy asks, does intervention alter the structure? And people ask, okay, but does this make my family safer or more vulnerable? Does this increase the risk of retaliation inside my neighborhood? Because you can change the law, but inside my neighborhood, where my neighbor is a colectivo and he has an AK-47 just behind my door, does that increase a risk for me? Does this affect the political prisoners still detained because they are inside cells, even though we're changing things outside? Does this harden the regime's narrative of external aggression? And in conversation with Venezuelans lately, both inside the country and in exile, there is often this recurring tension. You know, there's this, okay, anything is better than this, but on the other hand, there's this fear of escalation that may produce greater securitizations. They're watching us more. So when we evaluate intervention, we must widen the aperture. Does it weaken or pressure the regime is not just the question. It's more like, how does this reverberate on people? So now I'd like to, again, to finish really quickly, to talk about a very important law that was adopted yesterday in Venezuela. Maybe you've heard of it. It's the Amnesty Law Project for political prisoners. So if January 3 tested this whole coercive resilience, the recent amnesty law adopted yesterday for political prisoners is something else. It tests legitimacy. On paper, it's de-escalation, okay, we're going to free political prisoners, but on the ground, the reaction is a little more complex, because over the past decade, as I told you, according to Foro Penal, there's been 15,000 politically motivated detention. So people are a little bit tense. Families have lived through years of uncertainty, prison transfer losses. Some people have lost people in detention, restricted access, all this legal opacity. And what many Venezuelans, particularly families of political prisoners, express is this consistent concern. Okay, there's this law now, but without recognition, can there be meaningful forgiveness? Can we forgive the regime? And this distinction is really important for me, because external pressure seeks stabilization. Okay, the Americans have intervened. Does this seek de-escalation? Does it seek a reset of incentives? Domestic legitimacy operates on a completely different timeline. If political prisoners are released without institutional acknowledgement of abuse, without, let's say, a museum of memory, without admitting what history has done to those people, the immediate tension may decrease because of all the coercive apparatus that we've been talking about. Yet the underlying grievance remains unsolved. And this reconciliation without recognition can produce temporary calm. Everything is under control because there is a repression, but that doesn't build durable trust. And trust is the missing variable in Venezuela's political equation. There is no social contract anymore in Venezuela due to the revolution. So the deeper question becomes where the trust is. Is it in Maria Corina Machado? Donald Trump said right after the intervention that she didn't have the trust of the Venezuelan people. I think, as a lot of reporters, she might have had that trust after July 28th, but people are getting tired. Where is Maria Corina? Where is she not in Venezuela right now, fighting as the only opposition, solid opposition that we have? Can external pressure do the work that Venezuela institutions themselves have not done? And for many Venezuelan, the central issue is no longer simply whether the regime can be pressured, it is whether institutions can be rebuilt in a way that restores accountability. I'll let my colleague talk about this democratization process. I just wanted to show you two videos that might illustrate a little bit the fear climate that Venezuelans have been undergoing those past 2 decades. Those are two short, one excerpt from a documentary that I released last year, and one.
Hello. Can you just show one? Because we really don't have, if we have time, we can show it at the end.
Yes,
Thank you.
perfect.
I'm sorry, but we need to let Dr. Corrales.
I'm soy un loro. I'm a parrot, so you gotta stop me on that. Let's just show one of them.
The short one. The
Yes.
shorter one. Thank you.
One second, y'all. Okay.
Wait, no se escucha, Alex.
Oh, ¿no se escucha?
No.
Sorry, y'all. A ver. Ay, ¿por qué no quiere?
Should we leave it for the end?
Maybe.
Yeah, let's leave it for the end, and then we have, while you figure out what's going on, and we start with Javier Corrales. Can we unshare? Okay.
Okay, yeah.
Sorry about that. If we have time, we can do it, and then in the meantime, we can figure out. So I want to thank you very much, Flo. That was incredibly thorough, and yeah, these are a lot of these things we don't hear about, and we don't know what's going on in Venezuela. Now I want to introduce Dr. Javier Corrales, who's professor of political science in Amherst College. He is Dwight W. Morrow, 1895 professor of political science at Amherst College in Massachusetts. He obtained his PhD in political science from Harvard University in 1996. Dr. Corrales' research focuses on democratization, presidential powers, ruling parties, democratic backsliding, populism, political economy of development, oil and energy, the incumbent's advantage, political policies, and sexuality. He has published extensively on Latin America and the Caribbean. His latest book, Autocracy Rising, published by Brookings Institution Press in fall 2022, discusses the transition to authoritarianism in Venezuela since 2010s, with comparisons to Colombia, Ecuador, and Nicaragua. It argues that deep democratic backsliding is determined by party system features, variations in autocratic legalism, institutional capture, and innovations in the use of coercion. Thank you, Javier, for being here, and please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Marcela, and thank you to my colleagues, and I appreciate this invitation. I'm going to begin by saying something, by highlighting something that Gimena mentioned, and I'll say something about something that Flo said. What we're seeing in Venezuela is something a little familiar and at the same time highly unfamiliar. The familiar thing is, there has been U.S. intervention to change a government. This is not new. We know this dynamic. But here's the unfamiliar thing. I don't know of any other cases where the United States, after bad-mouthing a government the way that the United States has, and the entire community has, intervenes, and all it does is remove the top leader and leaves the dictatorship in place. In the history of imperialism, or in the history of democracy promotion, this is what? We've never seen anything like this. And as Gimena mentioned, now that the dictatorship has been left in place, discussion of transition to democracy has been relegated to a very, very, very low point. This is as strange, and I'm going to be very bold, this is as strange as if the United States, after the defeat of Germany in World War II and the death of Hitler, would have decided that the future of Germany means a partnership between the United States and the Nazi Party to rebuild Germany. We just don't see this. Either the Americans intervene and get rid of the troublemakers, or they don't intervene. What's going on here? I think it's going to take us a long time to try to understand what's happening here. Yes, there is imperialism, but there's got to be something more here. Let me offer some thoughts about what could be happening here. It may very well be that what we're observing is the first signs of populist foreign policy, something that we never really saw in the United States, even during the height of imperialism. The essence of populism, there's some elements of extreme populism, includes things like, well, liberal democracy is never the most important thing that rises to the top. You always see external actors as always taking advantage of you, and you're going to use only international ties to extract things for yourself. All populists approach the system that way. When we see a small country with that foreign policy, we kind of say, sure, we understand that you as a small nation feel that you're being exploited. But when a big power that has enormously favorable international settings making this argument about how the external system is such a threat and that elements are taking advantage of you and that you need to be given your rightful ownership of things, you're like, oh my God, this is a remarkable, strange, whiny thing to say. This would explain why oil has been really the top priority of what's going on here by the United States. It's also the top priority of the dictatorship. What is so remarkable is that in so many ways, what the United States has done is to deliver to Venezuela what Venezuela, the dictatorship, always wanted, which was some international actor to come in and fix the mess that they made in oil. The United States is happy to do this for Venezuela. They're going to take a lot of oil away from Venezuela. Venezuela has been comfortable with that. China has been doing that for many, many years. But the difference is that China didn't fix the oil sector. The United States may do this. Who's the happy actor here? The United States, not so much. It's actually the dictatorship, Delcy Rodriguez, hence the pact, hence the degree of cooperation. The other analogy that we have to think is that this isn't just any form of populism now running the United States, but right-wing populism, and this was alluded to by Flo. I am absolutely convinced that one of the things that was driving the United States is to be able to have an argument to make more deportations possible. If you always hear Trump, it's sort of like we want to help Venezuelans be able to go back. The United States, the Trump administration realized that there were many people from Venezuela who are being deported through ICE operations who managed to make it to courts. And in courts, they would make the case that the situation in Venezuela was a human rights calamity. And judges were not always, but they were ruling in favor of some of those cases. One of the things that the Trump administration wants to be able to do is to give no more justification to those kind of arguments that migrants from Venezuela are making in U.S. courts. And so we get this idea of, as Gimena said, oh, this was a great operation, and Venezuela se arregló. Remember that phrase that Maduro used to use after, the whole Guaido incident. So this comfort with keeping the dictatorship in place and working out an extractivist deal would have made very uncomfortable almost every U.S. president since at least Carter, even from the Republican Party, the extent to which the United States now is siding with its nemesis. But for a populist and an extreme right-wing populist with this idea of anti-immigration, this works out okay. The other analogy that I think we need to consider is the corporate takeover. I agree that the Trump administration became convinced that Venezuela was a threat. So the way that they responded is not by traditional imperialism. Go in, get rid of the bad guys, try to rebuild the nation. They would call it nation building. One could call it coming in to try to produce a conflict resolution, whatever. No, what they did was this. They did a corporate hostile takeover. It's like in the corporate world, when a corporation knows that there's another company that could be a threat, what you do is you take it over. You get rid of the CEO, maybe more personnel, but you keep the core business in place. With the instructions, now profits will come to me. What is the core business of Chavismo? One is extractivism. That's being kept and it's going to be bolstered. But the other core business is what Gimena alluded to and Flo expanded on eloquently. Major repression. Her discussion of the colectivos and the militaries and the human rights abuse and the fear. This core business has now been incorporated into U.S. Business in Venezuela. Now the United States has acquired this branch of operation. And the extent to which there's comfort with this in the White House has to be very, very bothersome for those of us who believe that human rights may not always be the top priority of the United States, but it shouldn't be the lowest or the non-existent priority. Let me also say something like this. While we need to be able to condemn the illegality of what the United States has done, it's very important that we keep in mind that the core business of Chavismo is in place, and it is absolutely nasty. There were 20 or so efforts to try to organize a democratic election with diplomatic activities and international involvement, the Barbados Agreement, a bunch of actors. All of them were sabotaged and destroyed by the government. There was far more illegality done by the Maduro administration and its predecessor than anything that might have happened by the United States. That said, by acquiring this corporation, I'm sorry that I'm using this analogy, the United States now is terribly implicated on a lot of the horrible things that will continue to happen in Venezuela. This is what needs to bother us at this point. Now, I don't want to end in a final note, and this is my last point because people are ready to say something. Is there a path forward? I mentioned that we saw something very familiar, US interventionism, something very unfamiliar, the United States leaving the dictatorship, the troublemakers in charge. But there is one more thing that's familiar here that gives me a little bit of hope. In all transitions to democracy, when we get to a point similar to what we see in Venezuela, we see some hope. What is the point that we're at? The founders of the autocracy are gone. That is the most wonderful part of the story. Chavez Madurismo is gone. We have somebody who was implicated, not so much in the founding, but in the running of it. We have seen many transitions of democracy that do take place in the hands of insiders from the regime. In the Dominican Republic, for example, the transition to democracy after Trujillo was done by Balaguer, a very close person to the dictator. In Spain, we saw that it was Adolfo Suarez, a close person of the Franco regime. It is not out of the question. Even if Delcy Rodriguez is not fully committed, forces can change inside Venezuela that may produce some type of movement in that direction. I don't have time to expand what route that might be. It is not that unfamiliar territory. It could happen. What is unfamiliar is that this time around, we really cannot count on the United States being an external partner in an effort to democratize, a reliable external partner. That's going to be the tricky game here. The Venezuelan Democratic Movement, which has all my admiration and in fact envy, because I have seen the Venezuelan movement, democratic movement, receive so many attacks, and yet they have endured and survived and remain resilient, and they don't give up, and they have never become violent. Absolutely remarkable. They now face a double challenge. They face the challenge of Delcy Rodriguez now is being sponsored by the United States. That's a terrible thing. And the second challenge is the United States may not be interested in a movement toward liberal democracy. That's a real challenge. But nevertheless, the moment is the best moment that Venezuela has had. Situations where the ruling party has left behind the founders. There is a lot of discontent, and the ruling party feels like it needs to do something to regain some kind of respect, offers many opportunities for agreements that can lead to democracy. So despite the bleak news, I am not fully pessimistic. And let me just stop there and invite questions. I think people are ready to begin to ask each one of us questions or make comments. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Javier, Gimena, Flo. This was great. A lot of information. I'm sure people want to ask questions. As I said, we could put them on the chat, or if you have a question, please, raise your hand, and if I can't see you, maybe Cristal can help me with that, or Alejandra, because I'm having a hard time seeing everybody here. I don't see anything in the chat.
Yeah. Do you? I can't remember the second speaker's name, but
Can
do
you
you have?
introduce yourself so we know?
Sure. Yeah, my name is Eric. I'm a student at the U of A, and I think Jimena, you were talking about there being a need for rebuilding of trust in Venezuela in order for there to be a more positive outcome in the country. And I was wondering if you have any ideas besides, if you have any ideas on ways that could happen.
I was referring to rebuilding of trust in the armed forces because of the high level of corruption within the armed forces. How can there be real trust between the U.S. armed forces, the Colombian armed forces, and the Venezuelan forces, that the interest on the Venezuelan side will be to really go after these illegal armed groups on the border. It's a big question because discussing it with different people, it's not a situation where you just get rid of the people on the top and have the newer people move up, because these are people who are in a hierarchical situation where the level you need for the interaction are people that have already been there like 2 decades. And so they're entrenched in that system. And so I think it's a very difficult question to answer, but it's something that needs to at least be considered. The way that it's been presented so far here in the US is kind of like, oh no, okay, we'll just go in and do what we normally do with this armed forces, as if it's a completely different armed forces than it has been for the past 2 decades.
I'm sorry, actually, the question wasn't for you. It was for the second speaker, and I can't remember their name.
Hello.
But it was more of like a thought on a question about the social sphere and the way that in the social sphere, relationships of trust can be rebuilt in the institutions and like the political environment that they're in.
Yeah, I think the question of trust is central, as I said. I think one of the main concerns of civilians right now in the country is, where is the opposition? We have all our opposition leaders abroad. Where is Maria Corina Machado, Nobel Peace Prize? Why is she not within the territory? So I think, one of the things that one of my best friends was telling me a few weeks ago was, this feels crazy that on the negotiation table, there is no Venezuelan representation. So I would say that even though it's a complex process, it would start with actual Venezuelan representation at the table, not Delcy Rodriguez and the Trump administration, actual representation. Why is not Maria Corina Machado on the negotiation table? Why is Edmundo González Urrutia not invited to the negotiation table? And I think that's that the representation point is the main punto de partida. Everything starts with that, and trust will start being rebuilt when Venezuelans will feel that their fate is not just being talked by people who have nothing to do with them and who are not concerned by their interests. That's what I think.
There is a question on the chat by Annette Davis. She would like to hear from the three of you about discussions about releasing political prisoners, and if there are still arrests for political views that are going on right now. Gimena, do you want to take that one? Or
I mean, Will is concerned that there have been releases of political prisoners, but at the same time, new people taken in.
If there are release or political, or are there still people being arrested for political views?
According to reports that we have gotten in the past few weeks, there's still people being arrested.
Anyone wants to add?
Yeah, let me just say, this is super important. The reason Maria Corina Machado is not in Venezuela is because she's not allowed to be in Venezuela by the Venezuelan government. The Venezuelan government continues to ban leaders of the opposition, and especially the most important party of them all, both of them. The amnesty law is a humanitarian gesture. It's not a democratization step. Democratization requires that you legalize all political forces and you do not have the laws that send you to jail. Amnesty forgives those who have been sent to jail, but you're not changing the bans. And so we can count who's in, who's out. That's all a count of levels of humanitarianism. That's not a count of levels of democratization.
Okay, thank you. There's a question for Gimena, but I think both Gimena and Javier can tackle these. Do you have any thoughts about the future of the Cuban government, given what is happening? It's not about Venezuela, but I think there is a relationship in terms of the US government and how the Trump administration,
Well,
is.
from my point of view, I think that they're going to do everything they can to change the regime. Already they're strangling the island that was already strangled by multiple types of sanctions, and now they're pressuring all of the allies of Cuba of any sort. So I think if that doesn't work, I wouldn't be surprised if some kind of military action is taken. I mean, I think they've proven that they will do it.
Can I jump in here for a second?
Go ahead.
So I agree with Jimena, but I want to maybe offer a little bit of a slight disagreement. I think if there's regime change, the Trump administration would be delighted. But I don't think they're necessarily working towards that. I think they're working towards exactly what they've done in Venezuela, which is get rid of Diaz-Canel and bring an insider from the dictatorship to now sign economic agreements with the United States. Let me say, here's one of the strangest paradoxes. I'm Cuban American, and I have been following the career of Marco Rubio. Let me remind people of what the career of Marco Rubio and the efforts by the Obama administration in 2014 to 2016 to engage in normalization with the Cuban dictatorship. That was an effort intended to say, all right, we're not going to be able to produce big changes in the party, but let's give them a deal that they cannot refuse. Let's soften the economic activities and wait to see what's going to happen here. The biggest critic of making deals with the dictatorship, the heirs of Castro, and that back then it was Raul, his brother, was Marco Rubio. He built his career condemning United States economic agreements with the dictatorship and bad-mouthing Obama for saying that we need to we're gonna see whether this eventually leads to a transition. And now this very same group is essentially giving us the same type of foreign policy, a little bit more aggressively. I am worried that the way that they have discussed the success in Venezuela is making them feel that they can do something similar, that they can generate a military operation to capture Diaz-Canel, and then an insider is going to be put in. In the case of Venezuela, it was number 2 of the regime. They could find number 3 or they could find somebody, but that's the model that we have in place. And then immediately begin to talk about economic reconstruction. That's not going to be the ideal outcome for the Trump administration, but it'll be ideal enough. And I think it's a real possibility. I don't rule it out. And it's going to be, of course, sold as a triumph for democracy and blah, blah, blah. But it is a very remarkable scenario. What, if you replicate the Venezuelan model into the Cuba, in the minds of folks in the White House, it's very doable.
Thank you, Javier. And I should say that question came from Edward Shannon, who's one of our students in Latin American Studies. And I have another related question from Susan Hutzler. Will Cuba move towards wind and solar power? Do we know that?
The Caribbean, not just Cuba, the Caribbean is a area of the world that shockingly is incredibly reliant on hydrocarbon fossil fuels. Mm-hmm. It's remarkable because it has a lot of sun and a lot of wind and a lot of water, and so it could use a lot of renewables. The reason very few Caribbean islands, especially Cuba, hasn't transitioned is because it's very expensive and the international community hasn't been able to help. The United States is not going to help Cuba or any Caribbean island in the climate that we're in. But it is absolutely true that Cuba's energy sector is exclusively reliant on foreign oil. And at some point, that needs to be addressed. But it's really not the priority now. It ought to be. It is a major Caribbean urgency. The only Caribbean island that I know of that is taking this challenge seriously of having a transition to solar, wind, and water sources of energy is Barbados. Everybody else is lagging behind, and Cuba is probably at the very bottom of this line. So thank you for raising the issue, but it's not going to be coming in the near future.
Thank you, Javier. Anyone who wants to jump in with a question or a comment?
I can ask a question.
Yeah.
My question is specifically to Flo, and it is about how, as a reporter, have you been able to approach people, especially in Venezuela, where, maybe it's scary to talk about it. It's maybe possibly even scary to talk to a reporter because of the ability of maybe someone from the regime, finding your sources. So if you could talk a little bit about that.
Surprisingly, working on Venezuela, the difficulties never came from the community's trust. I think one of the most trusted actors, among the most trusted actors in the country, journalists have played a big role, especially when it comes to political prisoners. People go to them to be able to have a tool, a pressure tool. I think the main concerns of people when they come to you and when they talk to you is, how are you going to blur my face? Are you going to distort my voice? And those are just basics, 101 that we've been working with for 2 decades. Not me, because I was a kid, but people just. So I think surprisingly, working in Venezuela with the community is even easier than here. People trust you as one of the last pues, organs of trust. Yeah.
Okay, I have a question here from Stephanie Grader, who's one of our faculty. Thank you so much to our speakers. Regarding Javier's final point during his presentation, could you expand on what type of democracy you see possible with the type of extractive U.S. corporate control that is central to the current situation?
Right. Look, I don't want to minimize the challenge, but what you need to be able to have is a process through which you de-radicalize all the actors. The international community has a lot of experience with that. This is what you do in any type of conflict resolution. So that's number one. The second thing you need to be able to do is the ruling party is absolutely scared of elections, very scared of elections, scared of losing. The way to deal with that is you need to make sure that you turn elections less into a winner-takes-all system. And the losers don't feel that they lose a lot. If you go into that step, which is a step towards what we would call minimal democracy, just making sure that elections work, the next step is to have a pact of non-aggression. This means that moving forward, the actors are never going to be engaged in a type of hurting the other side. There has to be the concept of transitional justice. This is a complicated subject, but that's very compatible with this idea. So I would always say getting through elections is super important, but that's not enough. You need to move into a system where there is going to be this pact of no aggression and an adapted version of transitional justice. The formula is not, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. Folks like people in WOLA, even Marcela, who's worked in communities where you have to move from conflict to coexistence, We have templates to do it, but it always requires good international partnership, a lot of maturity, a lot of coaching. The one good thing I'm going to say is this about the United States being involved economically in Venezuela. Yes, the United States is going to be gaining a lot from it, but there is going to be an economic recovery. There is going to be a return to some kind of economic well-being that can be channeled for good use in a democratization process. The little that you're going to get from it is going to be, I think, sufficient to help you with the kind of resources that you need to move forward democratically. Big challenge, but it's not rocket science.
So I have a related question to that. In terms of, Venezuela has always depended a great deal on oil. And it's not a diversified economy. And without that, it's very hard, to move forward. I don't know if you guys want to comment on that. How can Venezuela move towards a more diversified economy with this corporate model in which the US is going to continue to emphasize dependence on oil?
I can, if no, look, one of the problems with having dependency in oil is that it always gives the temptation for one political actor to want it all for itself. This ruins your politics. It feeds authoritarian politics and it makes the opposition feel like they're not getting anything. Complicated subject, and Marcela, you're absolutely right. It may be that in this kind of system where you have so much dependence on such an extractive commodity, liberal democracy will be effusive, will be hard to achieve. But the solution to this is you always want to make sure that you have a system whereby the management of oil remains fairly independent and insulated from political pressures from either the executive branch or societal groups. That's a very hard thing to do, but it's accomplishable. You want to make sure that you create a system of rules where no actor, either government actor or an opposition actor, feel that that is a pot of money that belongs to them. And that's step number one. But it is a reality that Venezuela is and forever will be highly dependent on oil, and we may wish it away, but it's really not going to disappear, and it raises special challenges that other societies may not necessarily have.
Mm-hmm. And I think I just had one more question about the implications for the region. Colombia is going to have elections pretty soon. I am very afraid that this whole issue in Venezuela is going to push more of the, extreme right into power. I would like Gimena to just quickly comment on that, and then I think we'll be done because it's already 2:30.
Sure. So, like I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, there's been a lot of lobbying from the right and the opposition in Washington against the Petro government, I think more than I've ever seen, from the former presidents directly lobbying to all of the presidential candidates, including the one that wasn't able to become a presidential candidate because he was assassinated, as well as many different actors that have worked on Colombia who are former diplomats and so forth who are not favorable to the Petro government. And so they were really banking on this meeting between Trump and Petro completely torpedoing and having Petro somewhat humiliated, because one of their big talking points was that they could do better with the most important relationship that the Colombian society has and their number one ally and so forth, right? So this kind of lowered a bit this meeting, even though, like I said, I'm not sure there's anything really concrete that came out of the meeting aside from the fact that it averted conflict. And at the same time, on the left, you had seen Ivan Cepeda start to be more anti-imperialist because of the U.S. aggression. That lowered that as well. So I think that it's going to be very likely that we have a more rightist president in Colombia. And I think that what scares me a bit more about that is that this could lead to some kind of new sort of play in Colombia, but more regional. Ecuador has been spending a lot of time too, getting into the good graces of the Trump administration. They're going to receive financing, military and security, and so I fear that what we might start seeing building is this upper Andes kind of regional cooperation, really kind of under the umbrella of the United States. And, we have so many lessons of how that sort of effort does not work to undermine organized crime in the end, and much less so illicit economies, which is sad because for the past 2.5 decades, I think there's been this whole learning curve of better type of cooperation if you really want to address the root causes of all these situations, right? But yeah, I think this is going to be a major issue in the debates, and what to do next. Already, the positioning in terms of the ELN, the only candidate who said that he'd be willing to reopen negotiation of any sort would be Ivan Cepeda, and he was on the negotiating team in the process that just failed. But all the rest were like, nope, we're just going to go after them and get rid of them and exterminate them militarily. And so this is my biggest concern, is that what was a more confined Colombia problem is now going to be a regional issue.
Okay, well, we're finished. It's time. We already went 5 minutes over. Thank you so much. This was very informative. I hope we can we can talk about doing something maybe written, a short thing that we can distribute as well. But thank you so much. This was very informative, and we are desperate for good information on Venezuela right now. So this was excellent. Thank to the three of you, and Flo put her Instagram there at flo.tomasi if people want to follow her. And I do want to see your videos. So I know they are in the chat if people want to just click quickly on them and see them on their own. Thank you so much. Sorry, this was sort of short and quick, but I really appreciate it.
Thank you, all of you.
Yes, thank you.
Adiós.
Adiós y mil gracias y suerte con todo, Jimena, ya. Y a ti, Flo, en Venezuela.
Bye, Alex.
Bye, Flo. Miss you.
Bye, girls. Take care. Bye.